Laws like Panchayati Raj, it gives opportunities to women to rise, to work, to function.
And that, I think, is what we have to build. That's the kind of country that I would like to dream of. And I hope that you will join me in that dream. I hope that dream is worth achieving as a country. A country where we can all be of service to each other. Thank you.
Constitution education, civic education, and then development education. If they can be all put into a triangle, that is a wonderful menu for a futuristic civil society working.
Now, I see that young India today in the towns and cities being the ones which will be at the cusp of change as we
get out there and act upon it rather than sitting in fancy spaces and talking about it to get past it. Sooner the better.
Thank you, Bindu, for that. So what you saw just now was like a quick glimpse of what happened during the 2 days. And the last part of the video that you saw was we all lit a lamp, like 2,000 odd people lit a lamp, basically symbolizing the tagline of the Civil Society's 20. Today, as we start this webinar, let me quickly introduce the key people on this call. I have with me Dr. Basavaraju. Dr. Basavaraju is the national coordinator of this particular working group called Delivering Democracy, Retrospect and Prospect. Basavaraju is also the executive director of GRAM India. And over to you, Basavaraju, for a quick 2 minutes in the opening.
Thank you, Jayashree, and namaste all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the people who are joining from different parts and time zones of the world. And I would like to address all of us as crusaders of democracy, because we day in and day out, we try to strengthen and deepen democracy in our own purview. I'm truly honored to be a host of this webinar series as a national coordinator on behalf of the Delivering Democracy Working Group in India. We are Delivering Democracy Working Group under G20, C20 in India. Consider this as a privilege to have this opportunity to host the speakers from Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, South Korea, and India. I'm sure Vasji is going to introduce each one of them to all of you. And we are also having an engaged audience from India as well as other nations. It's a matter of pride for all of us in India to host a variety of engagements during our G20 presidency with the theme Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That means one earth, one family, and one future. Friends, our G20 presidency, under our G20 presidency, our Honorable Prime Minister gave a call to make this G20 a people's campaign and not just a government's program. We under Delivering Democracy Working Group, taking G20 to the grassroots. We are engaging various sections of community from students to Panchayat, the village self-government. In fact, today's webinar topic is more towards this, how decentralization of governance and government can be ensured. Local self-governments, members to parliamentarians at the highest level. And we are also engaging academicians, and now all of you democracy champions from all the G20 nations. Through this webinar series, our objective is to learn from all the G20 nations on the, especially about what we call udaharans. That means the examples and the best practices and solutions for some of the issues which we are encountering from decades in our own countries. I think anything centralized is a problem. Be it waste to wealth, actually. If you have centralize it, then it becomes to process it, it becomes to solve the issue. Decentralization is the solution for all of this. When it comes to government, it is further more important. But unfortunately, we talk more about decentralization and do less to make it happen. I do not know what is the situation in other countries much, but we in India brought an amendment to our own constitution to bring a three-tier government. Earlier it was two-tier government. Now it is a three-tier government, that is central, that is federal, state, and the local self-governments, either urban local bodies or we have a panchayats, rural local bodies. The three-tier government system is there in India. But it was not a new for India. In fact, if you look at the history, if you look back into the history of India, we had samitis and sabhas even during the monarchy. So that means people involvement was there in the governance. But unfortunately, we seldom devolve the power to these decentralized government. And we have various reasons for it. Either it is political, it may be fear of letting go. The legislatures at the highest level, parliament level, parliamentarians probably have a figure of letting go. And we have an administrative issues. That means efficiency at the level of state bureaucrats. Perhaps probably we might think that they don't have an efficiency to manage themselves. Or lastly, the community level issues, that is lack of participations and they don't engage actively. All these things we keep citing and restraining ourselves from devolving the power to the people actually. And I'm sure you all agree, civil society, all of us, has always played a role of the catalyst in bringing different stakeholders together. And I'm sure we will get to learn more on decentralizing governance, models and methods adopted in your respective countries today. Well, I also think it would not be inappropriate if I use a minute more to introduce GRAM to all of you. We at GRAM engaging with all the four stakeholders of development through our evidence-based policy engagement activities. GRAM researches issues at the grassroots and work with policy makers more closely, not only as a think tank, but as think, act, and engage tank. The organization, which was just an idea a decade ago, which was independently started without any funding or seed money or seed capital, now works across the country, handled over 100 plus projects and work with over 10 international research and academic think tanks and several other national level organizations. We at GRAM taken coordination of this G20 engagement group as an opportunity to build and sustain solidarity among civil society organizations working for democracy and good governance in the days to come. I thank all our partners, particularly CUTS International for being our regional coordinator, and as well as my dear friend Amrit Singh for accepting to moderate this today's session. I also thank Benedetto, our international coordinator of the working group, not only taking part as a speaker today, but being a support to all of us in making this international webinar series a more effective and far-reaching. And I thank HSF, Ansidal Foundation, for their generous support, and all our partners who have directly and indirectly supporting us. And namaste, welcome you all again, and I look forward to witness an enriching discussion. Thank you so much. Over to Jayashree.
Thank you, Dr. Basavaraju. With us today, we have Vas Shenoy joining us. As you see, he's a journalist, a political commentator, and an entrepreneur. More importantly, he is the founder of Dialogue on Democracy, a Rome-based forum, which brings elected representatives of global democracies together. So he's also the working group member of the Civil Society C20, specifically the Delivering Democracy Working Group. He's the working group member. I would like to also introduce our moderator for the day, Amrit Singh ji. And Amrit Singh is the director of CUTS International, a global public policy research and advocacy organization. So together between Vas and Amrit Singh, we will actually moderate most of the deliberations today. The one beautiful thing about today's panel is we have a good mix of academicians and practitioners joining us today. So we're going to have a very balanced view of this whole thing as we get into the deliberation. Over to you, Vasji, for taking this forward from here.
Thank you so much, Jayashree, and thank you, Basavaraju ji, for all your tireless work that you've been doing as a part of this working group of democracy and delivering democracy. My role today is to introduce our wonderful speakers and to set a little bit of context. So let's go first to the context. Today we talk about decentralizing governance. What does that actually mean? Decentralizing governance is practically bringing democracy back to the citizens, bringing it to a local level and as small a local level as possible. And today we have participants from different countries, each of whom have a fundamental role in the democracy. For example, we have a participant from the UK, which could be called the first functional democracy, even though it's still a monarchic democracy. We have a participant from Italy, which is one of the most decentralized democracies in the world. We have a participant from Germany, which is a country that is built of communities at local level that then go right up to the federal level, and Korea, where a country that has long worked and dedicated itself to decentralizing democracy. And of course, India, which is nothing but an agglomeration of a lot of local, regional, and subnational entities that have merged to form the union that today we know as the Republic of India. That said, we have wonderful speakers today. We have Dr. Christian Raffer. Let me just share the screen.
Recording in progress.
Dr. Raffer is an economist and works at the German Institute of Urban. His focus lies on local government finances and autonomy. And he is one of the academics today who study decentralization of democracy, its positives and negatives. We have Benedetto Zaccheroli, who is the president of the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism, who comes from a long experience of local government, as well as recently he was former Prime Minister Renzi's chief of staff. We have Dr. Jang from South Korea, who comes from the Public Administrative Service, and he is the chief researcher at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Environment, as well as a lecturer, so academic. And then we have Matthew Robinson, the director of the European Gulf Information Center, which is based in Rome, Brussels, and Stockholm. Matthew comes with a wide range of experience at the European level, as well as the local level. He's also involved in politics in Northern Ireland. He chairs the British Conservative Party in Northern Ireland. So I think we have a wide range of points of view today, and without much ado, let me give the floor to Amrit Singh, who will conduct today's proceedings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vasji. And Amritji, please take over from here.
Thank you, Vasji and Jashriji. Thanks again, Vasji, for setting the context and introducing the speakers. From now onwards, we will have the panel discussion. For the panel discussion, the order of speakers will be, first we will take views of Christian, then Benedetto, and then Matthew, and then Dr. Jan. So first, let me invite Christian, since he will be making the presentation. So yeah, it's now visible. Christian, let me ask to you for basically, since you are an economist and researcher, I will request you to share your thoughts from an academic and research point of view on first, why should there be decentralization at all? And then you may also like to focus on the delivery of public services. It may include the fiscal aspects as well. And you may share the examples and also highlight the decentralization of governance in Germany. So over to you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amrat. I hope you can see my presentation right now and you can hear me.
Yeah, it's visible. Yeah.
Perfect. So, hello all. My name, as already said, is Christian Raffer. I'm a local government researcher at the German Institute for Urban Studies, and I'm very happy to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me. Today, I will talk about the topic of decentralization of governance, and I have set out the following plan. First, I will give you a brief idea of the general trend of decentralization we observe in the last decades. Then I will talk about very briefly about theory of decentralization. I have provided two maps which will give you a short impression on the status quo of decentralization all over the world. And I will then focus not on Germany, but on Sweden as a very nice example of a maximum decentralized country. And finally, I have prepared some guidelines for effective decentralization to provide you with a hands-on approach to decentralize. But let me start with the general trend of decentralization. Well, what do we see when we have a look into the empirics? What we can see is that in the past decades, there is a trend towards greater decentralization, at least among OECD countries. This means that both subnational spending and revenue has increased, but also further autonomy and local authority indices point towards greater decentralization. So there is kind of a mega trend in very many countries to decentralize power and also administrative decisions. The motivation behind these decentralization reforms are often the quest for more local democratic control, as well as greater efficiency in public service delivery and accountability for local development policies. One very interesting trend, which is also depicted here in the graph, is that we see a trend towards regionalization, which means the regions are usually kind of an intermediate level between local governments and the central government. And at least since the 1950s, we can observe that the regions are becoming more and more powerful. We see that in America, in India, and in Asia. So the first thing we learn here is that many countries all over the world are striving for larger or higher levels of decentralization. The question is, what is the theory behind that? Why are they doing this? Well, when we talk about theory, let me just start with a very basic thought about economic functions of government following Musgrave. These are allocation, distribution, and stabilization. What we know is that local governments are not very well positioned to redistribute income, since the sorting of citizens might be unfavorable, meaning as soon as a local government starts to redistribute income, rich citizens might move away and poor citizens might concentrate in such a local jurisdiction. So redistribution is not a thing local governments should care about. The same is true for economic stabilization. Local governments are not well positioned to establish own economic stabilization policies, since economic growth, inflation, unemployment, and these things are determined on larger regional levels. Where local governments are actually quite good in is to support an efficient allocation of society's resources, which means to provide goods and services that are not provided efficiently by the market. And this raises the question, which and how much services should be provided by local governments. One very naive answer, which we saw in the theory building of decentralization in the very early theories, is that there exist mechanisms that lead automatically to a welfare maximizing provision of goods and services by local governments. We can talk about taboo sorting or yardstick competition, but I want to focus on the rather famous decentralization theory proposed by William Oates in the 70s. And it basically says that local governments can provide public goods efficiently, since they simply know best and better than the central state about citizens' preferences. So this is one basic assumption. And behind that stands the assumption of kind of full information. Well, today we know that this is or maybe an unrealistic assumption. Another assumption behind this decentralization theorem is that there is some kind of benevolent politician or public official that strives to maximize citizens' welfare. So we assume that the politicians on the local level are always trying to maximize the welfare of the people. This is true for many jurisdictions, but what also is true is that politicians usually follow their own agenda as well, which means politicians and well, first of all, politicians try to maximize re-election probabilities, and this can have some deviating consequences, like in fiscal terms, a deficit bias. And this is why there is kind of a second generation theory of decentralization, which tries to answer these risks by, for example, fiscal regulation. So what we learn here is that decentralization is a good thing. There are many motivations to do that. However, there are some risks attached to it, which we need to have in mind in order to structure our decentralization efficiently and in a way that it works. Well, there are further risks. I just want briefly mention that decentralization might be accompanied by more corruption. There are some empirical results which are supporting this. And also, for all these theories I've talked about, we have to assume that there is a highly diversified set of citizen preferences which do not always apply for developing countries. Also, the administration is not always doing what politicians want. There's kind of a principal agent situation here, which might hinder decentralization. And there are a lot of some other risks we could talk about. I would here suggest a paper, a very famous paper published by Prudhomme in 1995. Now, next point is dimensions of decentralization. In what or in which fields do we observe or can we decentralize? There is political decentralization, there is administrative decentralization, and there's also fiscal decentralization. These three dimensions are overlapping in many parts, but they also have their own right. Political decentralization is has a lot to do with the decision-making power and the citizen participation on the local level. This is what the first speakers talked about. There's also administrative decentralization, meaning the responsibility to provide services, to administrate services on the local level can be decentralized. And of course, all these need to be accompanied by fiscal power, which is then described by fiscal decentralization. So I've then prepared a couple of maps which should show you first and foremost one thing, namely that decentralization all over the world is quite dispersed. So we have in many countries rather low levels of decentralization, but there is a set of countries with very high levels of decentralization. What we see here on this map is local government expenditure as ratio of general government spending, and I took the data from the IMF Fiscal Decentralization Database. The coloring of the countries tells us that the red countries are those which are most decentralized in terms of expenditure. In the red countries, more than 27% of all government expenditures are spent by local government, which is quite a lot. And the set of countries here comprises Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Japan, but also South Korea, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Nepal, and Indonesia. When we have a look into revenues, we see a similar but not the same picture. Here we can see that the countries and the level of own revenue, the revenues they kind of collect by their own as a ratio of general government revenue. And again, the red countries here are the most decentralized countries in terms of revenues. And again, we have here Iceland, Sweden, Finland, and so on. So there is a set of highly decentralized countries, but there are also many other countries which are not that far in their decentralization at the moment. And we need to consider that. So referring to the OECD, to the most decentralized countries, there is a set of most decentralized countries comprising Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Japan, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. And Sweden is a very nice example for a highly decentralized country, and therefore I want to give you some insight into the Swedish case. As you might know, Sweden is a rather small EU member state in Northern Europe. It has about 10 million inhabitants, and the government structure includes 2 subnational levels, 21 counties and 290 municipalities, both with own self-governing local authorities dealing with different responsibilities. The country has a long history of decentralization. Before World War II, Sweden, but also other Nordic countries had experienced mass unemployment, high poverty, poor public service delivery. The Swedish approach to that comprised successful administrative and fiscal decentralization reform, which now makes Sweden quite successful in terms of decentralization, but also of economic performance. Today, the Swedish constitution gives explicit recognition to the principle of local self-government, and the Local Government Act kind of spells out the framework of local autonomies, assign specific competences, and lists the revenue sources for local entities. And these are 3 major points for effective decentralization. And this already brings me to my last slide for today, namely guidelines for effective decentralization. And I am referring here to a publication from the OECD, which has the title Managing Decentralization, I think. Oh no, Making Decentralization Work. And if you're interested in these guidelines, which are very hands-on, please have a read in this OECD publication. They have a list of 10 guidelines. I want to highlight 4 of them, which from my perspective are especially important. The first one is, it is important to clarify the responsibilities assigned to different government levels. This means that the responsibilities which should be decentralized need to be defined explicitly, and there needs to be a mutual understanding of all levels of government who is responsible for what. This is especially important in countries in which certain assignments or responsibilities are shared by different government levels. Another very important thing is that all responsibilities which a country wants to decentralize need to be sufficiently funded. This is kind of a missing link or a weak link, especially in developing countries, where responsibilities are decentralized to local governments. However, these responsibilities are not always sufficiently funded. And as soon as the money is not there for providing these services to the citizens, the whole system doesn't work properly. It is also important to strengthen subnational fiscal autonomy to enhance accountability. So local governments need to have the right to decide how to provide services. The central government's role is to set the regulatory stage in this case. And the third guideline I want to highlight is, it is important to build adequate coordination mechanisms across levels of government. As soon several levels of government share responsibilities, and this is very often the case in practical decentralization, there need to be good coordination mechanisms which enables all the participants to talk about the responsibilities and to think about how to provide services more efficiently. So that's been all from my side. I know that was a lot and it was quick, and I tried to provide you with kind of a research perspective on decentralization. And I'm very happy that we have 2 or 3, I think 2 more practitioners here who can kind of spell this theoretical framework out by giving us nice examples on how decentralization works on the local government level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. I'm just taking over for a small service announcement. All participants, could you please keep your questions till the last speaker has spoken, so that there's a Q&A session that Amritji will conduct. So please keep your questions till the end. Over to you, Amritji.
Thank you, Vasji, and thank you, Christian, for sharing your presentation and thoughts with us, especially on the decentralization best practices around the globe and also OECD guidelines you have shared. So I will come back to you with questions. And now I invite Benedetto to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Amrach. Thank you, all the organizers, to having me. Thank you the moderator, the other speakers, but also thanks to the audience that is really numerous today. And I'm really glad to be heard, but also to hear the question and answer to our really efficient panel in this 90 minutes time that's God or whoever sent to us. So after the intervention and the speech of Christian, I realized that there is a real, let me say, gap between the academics and the political stage, because sometimes when we hear from some academics or institute or somebody that studied the situation, we have just the light picture, the last picture that present us the difficulties when you treat something that is affected by human beings, because also the politicians, also the people that govern us are human beings. And when we speak about decentralization, we speak about decentralized power, and that need to be understood as, first of all, as power to do something, not power to be somebody. That is the first. And that remember us that there is one time within the democracy in which the decentralization of the power is the cornerstone, that are the election day. In there is the maximum of the decentralization, where the people can speak and design his government for the further years. So then, decentralization, I was really sad that in the Christian presentation, there was not data from Italy about decentralization, because in Italy is just yesterday it started a new discussion about a reform of the constitutional law that the last time was 7 years ago, that took an attempt and failed by our citizen referendum, that was affected by the polarization of the political party and was a failure. So, but all the democracies are absolutely experiment the need of decentralized power. I have some example for you in the last years. I have some example for you at the local level. Just I try to start from that level. Decentralization at the local level, like a town administration or a neighborhood administration, means give between the elections power back to the citizens, as Vas mentioned to us at the beginning. So to involve citizens. Democracy doesn't exist if there is not citizen with culture and education, and citizens that are like individual watchdog. And in this process, the civil society is a watchdog of the democratic process. It is not enough to be present at the election box every 5 or 7 years or wherever. So has to be really, let me say, the attention of the citizen and the possibility to be effective in the governance of a city is not only during the election, but has to be a process. There are 2 cities I want to give you an example in Europe that are my born city. I don't live anymore there, but my born city, that is Bologna, and the European Capital of Democracy of 2023, that is Barcelona. They are set up 2 different models of participation, that is the real decentralization of a government, 2 participation model. The first in Barcelona is the Decidim. I write something and I ask, I apologize if I read something, but just to be briefer. So the system of participation in Barcelona is called Decidim, that in Catalan means we decide. So it's a platform that promises to ensure equal opportunities, remember that, equal opportunities for all people, as well as for their proposal or other contribution the platform might host. It's a platform, it's totally online. The platform will offer equal starting opportunities to all participatory objects, could be proposal, debates, other topics, for them to be viewed, discussed, commented, evaluated, or treated without discrimination of any kind. Other two words after the first, that was the equal opportunities, are accountability and responsibility. A commitment to citizens shall be taken to respond to all queries and contribution in the shortest time possible. A commitment shall also be adopted to follow up the results of participatory process and to respond to those demands which specifically requested. Finally, a commitment shall be taken to study the incorporation of indicators to monitor the participation process once they are finalized in order to systematically evaluate its implementation. This is the CDIP. It's for everything. Could be financial decision, could be political decision, could be everything. And it's really, really basic. It's really at the bottom. If you have enough number to grow a discussion, that discussion has to be taken to the town council, and the administrative body has to discuss and to decide at the end. This is also interesting, that at the end, the decision come back to the political elected body. That is the only one, according to a democratic path, entitled to finally decide. But he has to hear, not only during the electoral campaign, where often they are speaking, not hearing, but they have to decide finally and take the responsibility of a decision. The second example is from Bologna. Bologna has a different participatory way, that is to allocate resources for something. For example, this year, Bologna, so from a side, Barcelona is 1,600,000 inhabitants. Bologna is smaller, is 3 times smaller from Barcelona. They allocated, the town council allocate resources. This year is 3 million euro, allocated these resources, divided equally in the 7 neighborhoods of the city, and the citizen, after 1 year of process of public meetings with the politician, they can decide and present project to make better the situation. Could be urbanistic decision, could be something that affects schools or refurbishing some building and so on in the city. After that, there is a public vote on a public platform of all the citizens that they wish to vote in each neighborhood, which project will be the winner and take the, in this case, 500K euros to proceed with this project. This is the most possible efficient decentralization that I know at the bottom of our society, that are the cities. But there is one more. That is, for example, in Europe, the immigration and hospitality of refugees and the other, that usually see the distance between the national and, in our case, being part of the European Union, the European level and the local level. I mean, during a European Council, they decide maybe the quotation of part of the migrants that each state in European Union has to reallocate the migrants that arrive on the European Union shore. And that is normal. At that level, migrants are only numbers. There is not people, there are numbers. And is a, let me say, like a market of numbers between the head of states or prime ministers. What's happened for the migrants? They don't arrive or reach a state or the European Union. They come to a singular city. They come to a community. They come to Bologna, in the case of my own town, but they come to Berlin, they come to London, Paris, Nice, Barcelona. And it's that level that can absolutely understand better the needs and be the interface between the whole community and the individual migrants. So the policies of hospitality, let me say, or welcome to the newcomers has to be decentralized, because it's something that implied, let me say, a human added reality that cannot be seen from the top. From the top, obviously, is not a bad thing. They are just numbers. And that is one of, is a thing that explains us the need that we have of decentralize some policies to the local level, and not only to keep the power on the top level. The things, according also to what was saying Christian before, is in which field we can decentralize. Are the taxations, are the health and the general welfare, are the education, are the culture? How is possible that when the politician at the different levels seen a different political situation? There was also, if Vas asked to put the question after our discussion, but there is already a question, and I wish to answer already. If it's not in the constitutional law, nothing can happen. Has to be forecasted and foreseen in the constitutional law. Or if it's not, the need is clear. And in this sense, also the civil society can play a role to lobby in this sense and to have an efficient decentralization of the power. So the decentralization has to be seen as the hinge between people, the citizen, and the public administrators, from the top level to the smallest level in the administration of a country, but also between the politicians and the citizens. Otherwise, the mechanism of the democracy couldn't survive for economic crisis or health crisis. All we know what was the big debate during COVID, that the democracy, the Western democracy, were more weak than some, let me say, authoritarian or less democratic country in tackling the health crisis and the health needs. Because democracy is something that implies time, that implies discussion, that implies vote. And so decentralization is absolutely need with an equality system of redistributing the resources between the different levels. If there is no resources, as in the last picture Christian showed us, if there are not resources, doesn't exist a decentralization. Because with words, nobody can eat. But we need governance that can do something physically, efficiently for the people, for their life, and to give them back the dignity that democracy represents in itself. I think for this moment, I'm really fine to give back the floor to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedetto, for sharing your well-conceived thoughts, especially on the structural aspects of decentralized governance. And we will come back to you with the questions. And before I invite the next speaker, may I request all the participants to keep their questions and share in the Q&A feature. They can share. And after the panelists speak, these questions will be taken up. Thank you. And now I invite Matthew Robinson for the next speak. And Matthew, may I request you to share your thoughts, focusing on the, especially the experiences you have from the European countries, and especially from UK and Northern Ireland.
Pleasure, and thank you so much to the G20 Civil Society Delivering Democracy Working Group at the Secretariat, Thank you so much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to speak on this panel. So before I get into the weeds a bit on my own experiences from a practical standpoint, I wanted to look back a bit, and certainly my academic background is in law, especially in constitutional law. And when we look at decentralization, I always think to well-regarded US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. And back in 1932, there was a well-known Supreme Court case, New State Iceco versus Liebman, that was looking at powers of US states to be able to regulate. And in this case, powers are restricted, but in his dissenting opinion, Brandeis left the court and left the American people with this thought, and I quote, "A single courageous state, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country." And what does he mean by that? From an American perspective, but this is, I think, applicable across the board, devolved and decentralized models, whether that's a US state or in the UK terms, one of our local authorities, or I'm in Northern Ireland right now, one of our devolved regional governmental systems, can try certain policies on a case-by-case basis, see how it works out without having a detrimental or overarching national effect. It can be tried on a local or regional level. If it works, it can offer as a good blueprint for something that can be rolled out on a national level, what Brandeis called a laboratory of democracy. And that's something I always think back to when I think of what we coin in the UK as devolution, certainly since the late 90s, when the then Labour government under Tony Blair rolled out a historic level of regional and local devolution across into Northern Ireland, into Scotland, into Wales, and into local authorities. But when we think about from a British standpoint, when we think about devolution, what are we talking about here? Well, I think some of our excellent speakers have already touched on this a bit, but principally, we have political or democratic decentralization, administrative decentralization, fiscal decentralization, but also economic or market decentralization. And arguably, the UK already has a certain degree of market centralization, especially over the last 13 years of the current Conservative government. But what do we mean by political or administrative decentralization? The UK, while it considers itself to have quite a high level of decentralization, certainly domestically, we consider that. Why does it not feature therefore as one of the key examples internationally? It's because in classic British form, we have somewhat of a patchwork quilt of devolution. We don't have a formal form of federalism. We have certain powers on certain case-by-case basis that are devolved to the regions. For example, this is just Scotland has a high level of devolution compared to the likes of Wales or Northern Ireland. Scotland even has some devolved tax powers that have been handed to it now that are quite unprecedented. And then you have examples like Wales that has a slightly more restricted level of devolution. Then you have certain regions like London that have, while not a country within the UK, have certain heightened levels of devolution. Then you have local authorities, you've got local mayors, but there is no, unlike our American cousins to the West that have a written constitution and these things are clearly laid out on a legal basis, from an American standpoint, obviously the 10th Amendment that states all powers not delegated to the US by Constitution nor prohibited to the states or reserved to the states respectively to the people. That offers a clear legal basis for local control and authority on a state-by-state basis. We don't have that in the UK. In fact, we don't even have a written constitution in the United Kingdom. So in this regard, Parliament is king, the British Parliament is king in terms of handing and decentralizing and handing these powers back to the people, back to regional authorities. And before I just offer you some of my personal examples, I want to give you just an insight and yeah, as a caveat, and I think Vaz mentioned this, I serve on a political level the current party of government in the UK, the British Conservative Party. So I will have my own political biases, I guess, in terms of support of the current government's direction. But since 2010, starting with David Cameron, and this has lasted through Prime Minister Theresa May, Boris Johnson, shortly under Liz Truss, and currently under Rishi Sunak, have tried to bit by bit in decentralized control. And where did they look? What were the motivating factors that the UK government within the last 13 years have placed in decentralizing? Well, they've listed these things. 1, lifting the burden of bureaucracy. 2, empowering communities to do things their way. 3, increasing local control of public finance. 4, diversifying the supply of public services. Also opening up government to public scrutiny, and finally strengthening accountability to local people. Now, what does that mean? And having run as a candidate on 3 levels of government, I've run for the UK National Parliament, I've run for the Northern Ireland Regional Assembly Parliament, I've also run in local government. For these, for that type of ambitious level of decentralization, to hand that much power back to the people, I think we need to remember that an important component of this, and that's public understanding of what that actually means. And what I think is hugely lacking, and while we can sit here as academics, as experts in our own field, in a hyper policy wonk type scenario, we can grasp and understand some of these concepts. A lot of the average punter, the average voter, struggles sometimes to fully differentiate what type of powers are reserved on a national basis, what type of powers are reserved on a regional basis, and what type of powers are reserved on a local basis. We have the obvious examples from a British standpoint: national powers broadly, still taxation is on a national level, security and defense, trade policy, all of these things are a national competence. But then you go down into regional decentralization, you're talking in terms of, from a British standpoint, health, education, even infrastructure. And then you go down onto the minutiae of local government. What are we talking about? We're talking about potholes. We're talking about when is your recycling collected. We're talking about street lamps. We're talking about things like that. And there is a huge, and we're just going through a raft of local government elections now in the UK. There is a real lack of understanding of what actually is reserved to local authorities, what is decentralized at the very smallest local level. And quite often these elections, and I think to the detriment of decentralization, focus on national issues that actually have nothing to do with the very powers and that are decentralized to these authorities. I want to give one example. Our actual previous speaker, Missy, touched a bit on COVID, and I want to be a little controversial in across the board, there was an argument that some of these COVID powers would be better served if they were decentralized on a local or regional basis. The UK, in my view, and certainly the view most commentators, had a high degree of decentralization actually when it came to COVID, coronavirus laws and powers. And this had to be served through emergency legislation through the UK Parliament at the beginning of the pandemic that effectively handed these powers, because it was such a legal grey area, to devolved institutions, to the Scottish government, to the Northern Ireland executive, to the Welsh government, and to an extent to the Mayor of London as well. The problem with that, certainly as it relates to national communication, is that there was, I've through periods of the pandemic, a huge amount of confusion as to what was applicable and what jurisdiction. I mean, if you look at England and Wales, I mean, you have a very porous English and Welsh border. You had bizarre incidents where there were radically different COVID restrictions about 5 miles from one another because of the decentralized and devolved control of COVID regulations. So my view, and while I'm always an advocate for decentralized governance, I think there are certain issues of national priority, and I would look at the likes of the pandemic that we went through as less of a public health thing, and arguably could be more of a national a matter of national security, something of that severity. And I think going forward, certainly from a British standpoint, I think we would be better served on instances like that actually to look to centralize more control, if anything, for clarity of public message. I'm very conscious I've hit my 10 minutes, so I don't want to go that much over. But I'll leave you on this, and maybe I can elaborate a bit in the question and answer. I spoke to the local people's understanding of what is decentralized and what what is applicable on their local level. To ensure that, you need well-functioning and high-quality media at that. And obviously, while social media is everywhere, there is a role for state-funded, and we have this with the BBC in the UK, state-funded local media to ensure proper broadcasting in localized areas. And the problem we've had in the UK, especially right now with the BBC's budget being stretched so much, the first things to go are local media outlets. So certain, as it relates to media, certain media outlets are centralized. So if we're going to shine a light on some of these local issues and on these decentralized and examples of decentralization, you need high quality and easily accessed regional and local media. And that's not always accessible through private media outlets, because there's not always a financial incentive to have these. These things require a degree of state subsidy. This exists in the UK through the BBC, but these things are often forgotten about. And I think from a practical standpoint, a hugely important tool for public understanding. And with that, I don't want to go any more over my time, so I'll hand back. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew, for sharing your views. You have very well elaborated, taking examples from your practical experiences. And we will get back to you with questions. We have questions coming up in the chat box. So before that, I will move on to the next speaker, Dr. Jang from South Korea. And I will ask the organizing team to give access to Dr. Jang for presentation, please.
Dr. Jang, you have access and you can bring up your screen. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Jang, you have already heard the previous speakers, and they have shared varied experiences, and also from academic and theoretical point of view, and practical examples taken from different countries. Now, I will request you to kindly focus on this civic or community participation point of view, and how it can help in decentralizing the governance. So over to you, Dr. Jan.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. English is not my mother's language, so I will just read through my presentation. I'm Yongchang Zhang, and I will talk about a participation income project to remove marine debris and its possible contribution to creating a marine protected area in South Korea. So what is happening around the world and why? So this is my own view. As capitalism or market economy expands in a society, individuals become busier making money to survive. But we cannot live only with market economy. We need public goods such as environment, social welfare, and culture. Moreover, in a broad meaning, democracy itself is a public goods. But when the market economy expands and people become busier, they cannot participate in democratic politics. The democracy becomes weaker. Therefore, in order to strengthen and decentralize democracy, we need to provide people with incentives for participating in producing public goods. And people would not participate only with good hearts. This is the background of participation income. Participation income is the income paid for participating in producing public goods. Here, the public goods can include not only environmental services, but also social services such as childcare, social capital such as trust, and even politics. Today, I will give you an example of participation income project in South Korea. I will tell you how the participation income contributed to the environment and social capital of trust and communication. Today, I learned from Christian Raffa, Mr. Raffa, that decentralization is mostly referring to strengthening local government compared to the central government. I understand that this is very important, but my case is about the community level. I believe that in order to strengthen the local government, the community level democracy needs to be strengthened. So are you interested in my story? So marine protected areas provide good opportunities for sustainable development. Expanding marine protected areas has been encouraged by international institutions such as United Nations and OECD. I am living in Dongyong City, South Korea. In 2014, this red box. In 2014, I found a large sea area with seagrass in this city. According to Korean laws, a sea with seagrass can be designated as a marine protected area because seagrass is valuable for marine ecology. Therefore, I suggested my own neighbors, saying that let's designate this area as a protected area. It will protect our own livelihoods too. But my neighbors did not like my idea of marine protected area. This placard here, lower, saying that we oppose a protected area. They are just against me. And in 2017, again, my neighbors, they are opposing a protected area. So, but this opposition against the protected area comes from the trauma of the elderly people. They experienced the dictatorship of the ex-president of Mr. Park and Mr. John from 1960 to 1987. The dictators did not protect the livelihoods and property rights of the people when national parks were designated in the mountains and in the sea in the 1970s. Therefore, the elderly people believed that protected areas will deprive of our property rights. So they were against it. Therefore, I realized that restoring trust and communication is essential in order to create a new protected area. Fortunately, maybe, the resident in this village, in my village, had suffered the damage from marine waste, marine debris. which had been blown from aquaculture farms nearby. They had to clean up the waste by themselves before. So I made a proposal and luckily received the fund for a cleanup project from 2018 to 2020 from the Community Chest of Korea, and it is a non-governmental fund for social welfare program. The wage given to the elderly people was 10,000 Korean won, and this is about $10 per hour, and each person worked for 5 hours a day. And as the participants were mostly elderly, break time was given to them. And during the project, the residents had lots of talks together. The subjects include marine environment, marine protected areas, and how to truly develop the community. Sometimes the other stakeholders, such as government officials and experts, also participated in the communication. So in 2020, lastly, after 2 years, the community members resolved their misunderstanding about the marine protected areas and asked the government to designate the sea in front of their village as a marine protected area. And the government accepted their proposal, and their village sea was designated as a marine protected area in 2020. And it was really a big history in Korean history. It was a great success in Korean society. You will not understand how much it is difficult. So the structure of the project was like this. So the fund comes from Community Chest of Korea, and it was managed by a local NGO. And the local governments and local cooperative banks also supported it. And the local NGO gave income, wage to the community residents, and they cleaned up marine debris. And all together, they produced public goods, which is cleaner sea. So my conclusion is this. Participation income project can create public goods of social capital, trust and communication, and ecological capital, cleaner sea, which are essential for local democracy. Participation income is defined as income paid to people who contribute to producing public goods. And participation income has been considered a better alternative to basic income because participation income can encourage producing social services such as childcare and education. In addition, my case shows that participation income can contribute to protecting environment and strengthening local democracy. So I wish more public funds can be used for participation income. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Jang. You have elaborated very well the aspect of community participation in this whole process and taken very valid examples from your practical experience. And now the floor is open for the questions. We have some questions with us from the participants. I will take one by one. Due to paucity of time, I will first try to take one question each, only to each of the speakers. First question is to Christian. This is from Sahid Khan. This is a question is, how many countries have a constitutional mandate for decentralization? And if it is not a constitutional mandate, then what is the framework adopted?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for this question. An interesting one, which I actually cannot fully answer because I do not have the number of countries worldwide which have kind of put the local self-government into the constitution. However, what I can say is that it is crucial that local self-governance is codified in the law at one point or another. So it shall be recognized from my perspective, at least in domestic legislation and where practicable and where it works out in the constitution. In Europe, we have a very interesting initiative, which is the European Charter of Local Self-Government. I want to draw your attention to this initiative. This is kind of a set of rules guaranteeing that political, administrative, and financial independence of local authorities plays a role in the countries, and about 50 countries have ratified this charter, and it are monitored if they provide a sufficient degree of decentralization, which is in line with this charter. So what we can say is that there is this necessity to put it in the law, and that the forms of kind of mutual agreement between the central level and local level may function, but are prone to inefficiencies because it's simply too easy to deviate from such an agreement or to ignore such an agreement. So it needs to be in the law in one form or another. And what needs to be in the law is at least the services that have to be provided by local governments. This is one point, and they need to be very clearly described. And another thing that needs to be in the law is how the service delivery is funded. So the basic key points of local self-government needs to be enshrined in the law somehow. So this is my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. The next question is to Benedetto. This is how the local governments raise their own funds, and what are the other revenue streams available for this?
Of course, it's really easy to answer. Usually are local taxes that are foreseen in the law, or they are receiving from the top level. So in Italy, for example, there is a taxation that is national for the big part. And when all the money comes to the central state, there is a part of that money that are redistributed for the local government, regional level and local level. So the city level, this is it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now I have a question for Matthew. The question is, what factors should be considered when choosing a decentralization model for a specific country or a region?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Sorry.
What factors should be considered when choosing a decentralization model for a specific country or a region?
Best practice. Well, I think, and I'll reiterate the point that I made before. Beyond, I think engagement with local people, the electorate, citizens, is key, because without local people understanding what powers are actually decentralized and afforded to them on a local basis, those powers are broadly not going to be utilized to what they could be. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, in the UK, health and education are predominantly devolved, at least on a country by country basis. So Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and England all broadly have their, while funding comes centrally from the UK Treasury, the implementation and how health service and local education authorities are run are down to devolved government. But there's not an appreciation quite often on a local level on that, where they're looking to national governments and their members of parliament for accountability. When in reality, you shouldn't be looking from a British standpoint. You should be looking to your regional parliamentarians and regional government for accountability. We're in a unique situation in Northern Ireland at the moment where we actually don't even have a functioning devolved government because of internal Brexit disputes over the Northern Ireland Protocol. But I mean, I think the model, certainly from a British standpoint, I think the model exists. It's a form of patchwork devolution. But the understanding of local people and the electorate is key. And I think we need more engagement with civil society and importantly with the media. And more often than not, you see some, and I'm not pointing fingers at the BBC, but quite often you see examples of lazy journalism that at its worst can actually confuse the electorate. So what is devolved and decentralized and what is not. So I think understanding as to what is what powers are reserved and what level of government is absolutely key. Hopefully that answers that somewhat.
Thank you, Matthew. Now, I have a question for Dr. Zhang. The question is, what are the challenges which can be addressed when promoting community participation? Since you elaborated very well project which you carried out in your area, promoting community participation for governance. So what are the key challenges, or we say what was the biggest challenge for that?
The key challenge is to promote participation of the local people, community level. My experience, I will tell you in my experience that there is money. Sorry. People are very busy. People are very busy in Korea. The working hours in Korea is like 12 hours per day. So they are very busy. So I tried to do something like Mr. Benedetto said today, like democratic gatherings and meetings. Yeah, I tried, but people are very busy. They don't come, they don't participate. So money was, so I said, we should give money because because if you come to this meeting, you will lose your work daisy, the wage for today. So I needed to give them money. So it's my own opinion, but I don't know if the other people will agree.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang.
I think Benedetto wants to say something. Benedetto?
Thank you so much. Just to add and strengthen Matthew, things, but also Dr. Yang. So we have to take into consideration the role of the education, but not only the, let me say, normal education. When you are a kid, you go to the school and so on, but also there is a responsibility of the state and the government to, let me use this as a bold word, but to educate people or to communicate to the people. In Italy, there is a law for institutional communication. If the government or the local government do a bold decision, a really important decision that affecting people's life, as is obliged to put money to the communication of that. Because it's important that people know. And about the reforming system, we have to remember then people has to work, as Dr. Yang said. And they are not all these time available to understand and to do things and so on. It's for that being a politician and being in service is to serve, is a service to the community, and they need to be paid. I don't want to be a counter-populist, but so the politician has to be paid for that. Otherwise, they cannot just breathe and stop. They need at least to eat. But so, and remember that speaking about decentralization is something that is like speaking about engineering of our community life and body. It's not easy, imply times, to spend to understand. Normally, the people, when they buy a car, they go to a store to buy the car, and they look for the color of the car, the aesthetic, and the consuming. How much is the cost? Is rare, is really rare to see a normal citizens, normal under bracket, but so a normal citizen to enter in a car store and open the car and look to the engine. They are not interested. They don't have the time. I never, when I buy a car, I don't say, oh my God, my degree is in theology. Can you imagine a theologian that look in an engine of a car? It's like a miracle. But so the thing is that we need a constant education. And in this sense, there is also the role of the media. Sorry, I really was too long, but so it's something that is important.
If I may very briefly, and I think that's an excellent observation. You ask most people, would they like to have X or Y power decentralized or localized? Most people say yes. Most people's instinct is to have these powers and they, whatever they may be, at the most local form of control. But if you ask the same people, well, to implement these things, do you support X or Y spending or creating X or Y token civil servant or what there's some government bureaucrats implement these things on a local? Would you support that? No. So people quite often like the idea of decentralized powers, but to properly implement these things, and I think as Benedetto correctly said, to communicate these things and properly implement these things to engender a sense of understanding of local people, you need to spend money to create, whether it's local councillors or local regional parliamentarians, a raft of civil service to implement. These things cost money, and that's where I think we have the problem. People like the idea of decentralization and local control, but when it actually comes to creating more public sector jobs or politicians to implement these things, people are less enthusiastic about the spending to create some of these positions, and that's where, especially in an era of populism that's taken over politics across the board, that is a wedge point and a problem, with that issue. So sorry to jump back in, but that was an excellent observation.
I think this was really interesting. We should have done this as a round table more than anything else, because I think we would have had maximum effect. We're running out of time, so it comes on to me to conclude this wonderful webinar. We had 4 very decentralized examples. Dr. Raffer speaking about Sweden, Benedetto about Italy, Dr. Jang about a very specific community in Korea, and Matthew speaking about the United Kingdom in general. Whether we like it or not, the world is moving towards decentralized governments de facto. People are taking to Twitter, social media. Politicians these days are no longer worried about opinions every 5 years. They're starting to worry about opinions daily. Obviously, like all things bureaucratic, there is no framework, there is no money. But more and more, specifically in Europe, people are looking at the mayor, at the city councils for answers and services. So the city is actually becoming a service organization and not just a political organization. It might probably take decades for this to catch up. Also, politicians nationally will need to give up their powers, which is something no politician likes to do at national level. But as time goes ahead, it's just obvious that social media and direct participation by the citizenry on a day-to-day impact result assessment of the political strata will lead eventually to decentralization, whether we like it or not. So that said, I thank all our panelists for participating today, and I think we should have had a longer roundtable discussion. Thank Basav Raju and his colleagues at GRAM, and especially Jai Shri Krishna, who's been very, very fundamental to organizing this webinar and who stayed behind us and made sure that all of us showed up in time. And thank you again to my colleague Amrit Singh, who helped us coordinate this panel. Good evening, good afternoon, and good day to all of you in all the different time zones. And thank you very much for participating today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Vajji, for
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.